In the year 1199, one of history's most iconic warrior kings faced an end marked by an utter lack of glory. Richard the Lionheart, the formidable monarch who had instilled terror in the armies of Saladin and etched his name into the historical record of the Crusades, would not fall in a blaze of valor on a sun-soaked battlefield defending Christendom. Instead, his demise would come in a most undignified manner through the slow decay of a festering wound, as gangrene ravaged his flesh, a tragic consequence of his relentless pursuit of a rumored treasure, which may have been nothing more than a myth. This account is far removed from the heroic narratives Hollywood often portrays, and it starkly contrasts with the noble sacrifices celebrated by medieval chroniclers. It reveals the sometimes brutal and cruel reality of how a revered monarch met his end, highlighting unsettling truths about medieval warfare, medicine, and the capriciousness of power that challenge our perceptions of this so-called golden age of chivalry. For centuries, we have received a sanitized version of Richard's death, one that overlooks the grotesque details and the profound tragedy that unfolded within the confines of a modest French castle. The reality of his last days is far more devastating, human, and harrowing than any legend could convey. The demise of Richard the Lionheart was not merely the passing of a man. It marked the disintegration of an empire, the unraveling of decades of conquest, and the onset of an extended period of chaos in England. The events of those final, agonizing days in March and April of 1199 would significantly alter the landscape of Europe and leave thousands to suffer under the incompetent rule of his successor. Today, we will strip away the romanticized facade and confront the chilling truth of Richard's death. We will travel through those last hours, wound by festering wound, to understand why historians labeled this not merely as a death but as a catastrophe that profoundly changed the course of history. Prepare yourself for an expedition into the darkest recesses of medieval reality, where kings fell to mortality like any other man, where the ignorance of medical practices proved far deadlier than any sword, and where pride exacted a cost not measured in gold but rather through the loss of empires and the abandonment of people to tyranny. This tale recounts how a single crossbow bolt dismantled a kingdom, how a mishandled medical procedure doomed a dynasty, and how the greatest warrior of his age was brought low by something more fearsome than any enemy army: the undeniable, inexorable reality of human mortality. By the conclusion of this narrative, your perception of Richard the Lionheart will irrevocably change, for oftentimes the truth bears a tragedy far more profound than fiction could ever hope to encapsulate. To grasp the true horror of Richard's end, we first need to recognize the towering figure he embodied within the medieval world. By 1199, Richard Plantagenet had experienced more adventures than most could fathom in 10 lifetimes. He was not just a king, he was a force of nature, a living legend whose reputation was forged from sword and fire across the known world. Born in 1157 to Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine, Richard inherited not only crowns and titles, but also the warrior spirit and an empire that spanned from the Scottish borders to the Pyrenees. Unlike his father, who wielded the reins of power through political savvy and administration, Richard thrived on the battlefield, drawn to war like a moth to flame. He had proven his valor in the brutal rebellions that fractured the Plantagenet family, and when the call for the Third Crusade echoed throughout Europe in 1189, he answered without hesitation. While other kings debated and dithered, Richard mortgaged his kingdom, sold off lands and titles, and pledged he would even sell London if necessary to fund his campaign. His obsession with the Holy Land became total and consuming, ultimately leading to a tragic fate: a man willing to sacrifice everything, including his kingdom, his wealth, and his relationships, for the glory of warfare. Richard's exploits during the Crusades transformed him from a capable feudal lord into a near-mythical figure. His victories at Acre, his relentless march down the Palestinian coast, and his psychological warfare against Saladin weren't merely military endeavors. They were grand performances on the stage of medieval Europe. He became the archetype of the Crusader king, the embodiment of chivalric ideals, and a hero immortalized in countless ballads and tales. Yet, as Richard would soon discover, heroism carried a steep price, one that very few could afford. His fixation on the East resulted in the neglect of his western realms. While he fought in Palestine, his brother John conspired against him, and as he sought glory in the Holy Land, his continental possessions gradually slipped away. The very traits that earned him legendary status, his singular focus, his indifference to personal safety, and his willingness to risk everything for honor would ultimately prove to be his downfall. Upon his return from the Crusades in 1194, after enduring years of captivity in Austria and Germany, Richard found an empire in turmoil. His brother John had nearly usurped the throne, Philip Augustus of France had seized extensive territories in Normandy and Aquitaine, the royal treasury was depleted, the nobility was restless, and enemies loomed like vultures over a dying beast. The remaining 5 years of Richard's life were consumed by constant warfare, battling against a tide of loss to reclaim what had deteriorated during his absence. No longer was he the youthful hero on a quest for Jerusalem. He had become a hardened, increasingly desperate figure, fighting not for glory but for survival. Each campaign was a gamble, each battle a roll of the dice that could dictate the fate of the Plantagenet Empire. It was this desperation that led Richard to a seemingly insignificant castle in the Limousin region of France in March of 1199. He had received word of a discovery that filled him with hope, a treasure trove of gold and artifacts allegedly unearthed on the land of one of his vassals. This was the kind of boon that could fund another military campaign, equip a fresh army, and restore the regality of a crown tarnished by years of setbacks. However, the castle of Châlons-Chebrol should have been little more than a footnote in Richard's storied career, a minor fortification held by a rebellious noble that under normal circumstances wouldn't warrant a king's personal involvement. But these were not normal times, and Richard was no longer the invincible hero of the Third Crusade. He was a desperate man pursuing whispers of fortune in the twilight of his reign. The journey begins with Aidemar de Chebrol, the Count of Limoges, who was allegedly in possession of this fabled treasure. Accounts from that era vary widely regarding the specifics of what was found. Some spoke of Roman coins and golden vessels, while others suggested a cache of early Christian artifacts. What genuinely matters is not the actual bounty, but rather what Richard believed awaited him. Under the feudal agreement binding Richard to Aidemar, any treasure discovered on a vassal's land belonged to the overlord by right. But when Aidemar reportedly sent only a portion of the treasure to Richard, some accounts insinuate he withheld golden items, further stoking the king's fury. This wasn't merely about financial gain, though Richard was in dire need of funds. It was about respect, authority, and the fundamental societal bonds that held medieval Europe together. The political fabric of 1199 made this perceived slight even more intolerable. Philip Augustus of France was relentlessly testing the integrity of Richard's domains, and any sign of weakness in his control over his vassals would invite further French aggression. Richard could not afford to appear vulnerable, not with his empire hanging by a thread. Richard's choice to personally oversee the siege of Châlons-Chebrol underscores his character and his dire position. A secure king might have dispatched a subordinate to reclaim the treasure and exact punishment on his wayward vassal. Yet Richard had never been secure in his reign, and by 1199 he found himself short on time, resources, and options. He needed to make an example out of Aidemar, and he needed to do it quickly and dramatically. The castle itself was hardly a formidable stronghold. It stood atop a rocky outcrop in the countryside of Limousin and consisted of a simple stone keep surrounded by a modest curtain wall. Its garrison boasted a mere 40 men, a ragtag mix of knights, crossbowmen, and common soldiers. Against Richard's seasoned army, it should have crumbled within days. The siege that commenced in March 1199 was anticipated to be little more than a display of royal power. However, from the outset, there was an air of misfortune surrounding this campaign. Contemporaries noted Richard's unusual irritability and impatience during the siege. Perhaps he sensed that time was against him and that this minor endeavor might somehow take on grand significance. Medieval chroniclers, writing with the wisdom of hindsight, would later suggest that omens and portents warned of the tragedy yet to unfold. The calamity that awaited would transform this forgotten siege into one of history's most impactful military events. The intertwining threads of a king's greed, a vassal's defiance, and a moment's carelessness would set in motion the downfall of an empire, reshaping the geopolitical landscape of medieval Europe forever. March 25, 1199, dawned clear and invigorating in the Limousin region. King Richard had been besieging Chalais-Chabrol for several days. The operation was progressing exactly as planned. The castle's outer defenses had been breached, its supplies were dwindling, and surrender seemed imminent. On this morning, Richard's demeanor was confident, even buoyant. Contemporary accounts describe him sharing light-hearted banter with his knights and expressing delight at the rapid progress of the siege. He was already planning his next offensive, discussing with his commanders how the treasure from Chalais-Chabrol might finance a renewed attack against Philip Augustus of France. As evening drew near, Richard opted to conduct a personal inspection of the castle's defenses, a decision typical of his hands-on approach as a commander, one who avoided directing battles from a distance. Clad in his chainmail and coif, he made the fateful choice to forego a full helmet and shield, a decision rooted in overconfidence stemming from years of battlefield experience. After all, what threat could the demoralized defenders of a crumbling castle pose to the famously victorious King of Acre and Jaffa? The small party accompanying Richard consisted of himself and perhaps half a dozen knights and sergeants, slowly riding along the base of the castle's eastern wall. The king pointed out vulnerabilities in the masonry and contemplated the most effective positioning for his siege engines. Unbeknownst to them, above, a young crossbowman named Pierre Basil was preparing for what he believed would be his final stand. Pierre, a local boy rather than a seasoned soldier, was defending his lord's castle out of sheer necessity. Some historians assert that he bore personal grievances against Richard, perhaps due to family losses incurred during the king's many campaigns or lands wrested away to support the king's military endeavors. Positioned behind a merlin on the eastern wall, Pierre had loaded his crossbow and took aim, described by later chronicles as scarcely more than a youth, inadequately equipped and inexperienced in the art of war. Some accounts suggest he even wielded a makeshift shield, perhaps a large cooking pot, and wore whatever remnants of armor he could scrounge. By all rights, he should have been quaking in fear, much like most of the castle's defenders. But as Richard's inspection party passed beneath the wall, Pierre steadied his hand, took aim, and fired. At approximately 6 p.m. on that fateful evening, the bolt flew true, striking Richard squarely in the left shoulder just below the joint where his mail sleeve met his coif. The impact was ferocious. Crossbow bolts were constructed to penetrate armor, and from that distance, the broad-headed projectile buried itself deep into the king's flesh. Richard swayed but remained mounted, the years of combat keeping him upright even as agony ripped through his body. In the immediate aftermath, chaos erupted. Richard's companions sprang into action, rushing to aid their king while soldiers on the ground unleashed a hail of missiles upon the castle walls. Recognizing the gravity of his action, Pierre Basil discarded his crossbow and raised his hands in surrender. Having wounded a king, whether through intent or an incredible stroke of misfortune, he had changed the course of history with a single shot. Remarkably, Richard exhibited composure in those frantic moments following the strike. Contemporary accounts recount that he calmly assessed the injury, even joking about Pierre's aim. He ordered his men to cease their assaults on the walls. The siege would continue, but there was no need for further bloodshed now that surrender was likely. Aided from his horse, Richard was carried to his tent, where his personal physician, whose name has been lost to history, began examining the grievous wound. What this unnamed physician discovered filled him with dread. The crossbow bolt had penetrated deep, its barbed head lodged not just in flesh, but possibly within bone. The extraction of the shaft was imperative, yet fraught with peril. Doing so risked catastrophic hemorrhaging or the unfortunate prospect of driving the point even deeper. As dusk settled over that March evening and Richard lay on his campaign bed with the lethal bolt protruding from his shoulder, none could foresee that they were witnessing the genesis of the end of the Plantagenet Empire. The wound appeared serious but not necessarily fatal. Richard had survived more grievous injuries in earlier battles. However, medieval medicine would soon reveal that the treatment could be far more lethal than the injury itself. The endeavor to remove the crossbow bolt began almost immediately after the king was ushered to his tent. In the medieval world, such procedures were typically carried out by military surgeons, men of practical battlefield experience, yet lacking advanced medical training. Richard's physician, despite holding such an esteemed position, was about to face the profound limitations of their knowledge. Subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon to support our work and never miss an upload. Like this video, drop a comment, and share it with others to show your support and help us grow this historical community.